Don't take a picture. Clean my glasses. You have anything to clean glasses with? I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding. Hi, I saw you from like all the way back there. They're filling in. They're sort of filling in. Yeah. For anybody coming in now, there are plenty of seats around. There are a lot of seats over here toward the side. There are seats in the center. Please feel free to find a seat, and we're going to get started in just about a minute. There are a couple of seats up here. Debbie, there is a seat right there. My stuff is under the chair, but there's a seat next to the ambassador. Yeah. Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. So even as you find your seats, if you could we're going to get started. So you can feel the energy in this room. I mean, we've already had a chance to sort of meet and greet people and see people we haven't seen in a long time. And this is an incredible feeling. And it's been said already, and it will be said many times more. It is so great to be together again at this amazing GA. It is just such a great feeling. And I'm seeing so many old friends and meeting new friends and seeing people who I've only seen on Zoom for the last couple of years, seeing them in person and giving them hugs. It is just the best. So thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to see everyone together. So I'm Suzanne Grant from Delaware. Thank you, Delaware. I have the honor of serving as treasurer of the Jewish Federations of North America, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our first set of featured sessions at the first in-person GA in nearly 4 years. And I am truly honored to introduce our first guest speaker, who will address a very important subject. The title of this session is Combating Antisemitism While Building Flourishing Jewish Communities. Complex title as it is, challenging to build flourishing Jewish communities when anti-Semitism rages, and yet that is exactly what we need in order to stand up to such hatred. So there's a guy who's been in the press lately, and he's gone by a couple of different names, and quite frankly, I don't want to use any of his names, but you know who I'm talking about. In a piece for the New York Times last week, Bret Stephens, with a sharp sense of irony, thanked him for raising the awareness of the rise of anti-Semitism around the world. And indeed, people from all corners, many who have never been outspoken on this issue, have come out to voice their strong opposition and outrage at this person's comments and in general at the horrible recent rise in anti-Semitic attacks in this country and around the world. Today's featured session is designed to help us peel back the curtain and understand with a much clearer lens what's really going on, not only in the US, but also throughout the world, and importantly, how we can address it and fight it. Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt has dedicated her career to raising the awareness and fighting anti-Semitism. As the DeRote Professor of Modern Jewish and Holocaust Studies at Emory University, she helped to create the Institute for Jewish Studies and sought to ensure that students understood the significance and the history of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. She is probably best known for having been sued for libel by David Irving, one of the world's worst Holocaust deniers. The case, which lasted for 6 years and was heard in court in a 12-week trial, resulted in Irving being declared by the court to be, quote, a right-wing polemicist who engages in anti-Semitism, racism, and misogyny. The trial was depicted in the blockbuster 2016 film Denial, which was based on her book, History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier. And now, Ambassador Lipstadt is raising awareness and fighting anti-Semitism from the U.S. State Department as the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. The Jewish Federations worked hard to pass the legislation that elevated this important position to the rank of ambassador. And it speaks volumes that our State Department has an office to focus on and help fight anti-Semitism across the globe. And it speaks even more that the person confirmed as ambassador is Deborah Lipstadt. We look forward to hearing Ambassador Lipstadt's insights on what she has seen in her first 6 months in office and the road ahead for her, the administration, for all of us in combating anti-Semitism. The ambassador will be followed by a panel on how combating anti-Semitism helps build flourishing Jewish communities, where David Breifman, the proud CEO of the Jewish Education Project, will host a panel discussion on the rise of anti-Semitism, Israel delegitimization, and to what extent anti-Semitism is or isn't being experienced by our younger generation, and specifically how issues related to Israel, race, and social media are impacting their identities today. Thank you again for being here. And now, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. I just got off a plane from, I forget, in Europe. That's where I was. But first I went home to Atlanta to vote. As Suzanne mentioned, I've been in office now for 6 months. And sadly, I work in a growth industry. The best Rosh Hashanah wish I got from someone as I walked into shul was, may you have a light workload this year. Sadly, it hasn't turned out that way. Now, you know the threat of anti-Semitism well, so I'm not going to go through all the terrible things that you've heard and that you know are happening. Rather, what I'd like to do is talk to you about what I see as my job, how it is emerging, and what it is that I want to do. One of my first objectives, and this may sound strange to some of you, is to help people understand what anti-Semitism is. Don't people know what it is? But I think there's a lot of confusion. First and foremost, what some people fail to recognize is that anti-Semitism is a prejudice like other prejudices. It operates the same way. A Jew does something wrong, that's how Jews are. A Jew does something right, she's one of the good ones. That's the same way racism operates, misogyny, etc. But anti-Semitism has distinctive elements which make it harder for some people to understand and make it more dangerous. First and foremost, it's a conspiracy theory. That Jews are engaged in a worldwide conspiracy to bring down other groups, and the Jews are all powerful. Number two, it's ubiquitous. It's free-flowing. It comes from all directions, every place on the political spectrum. It comes from Christians. It comes from Muslims. It comes from atheists. And sadly, it also comes from Jews. But not only, and so that's a second. Conspiracy theory, ubiquitous. Third, distinctive element. I'm back in teaching mode. But you don't have to take notes. Third distinctive element is that in the case of most prejudices, the prejudiced person looks down on the person against whom they are prejudiced. If they move into our neighborhood, there goes the neighborhood. If their kids go to our kids' school, of course, all in quotation, they are our, there goes the school. Ugh. The anti-Semites looks down on Jews are dirty, Jews spread disease, Jews are disgusting. But here's the added element. The anti-Semite also, so he punches down or she punches down, but he also punches up. Jews are more powerful. Jews are all controlling. Think about what is the stereotype of the anti-Semite? The Jews are richer than us, they're smarter than us, and they use those smarts in a malicious way. They want to control us. They know how to be sneaky. They control all sorts of things. So if you're just punching down, you may loathe that group and want to keep them away from you. But if you're also punching up, you fear that group and you say, I must defeat them. They are the enemy. So they're not just troublesome, they are the enemy. Why am I so intent on getting people to understand what anti-Semitism is? Because over the years, and I'm sure you've heard it as well, I've heard it from Jewish students, I've heard it from colleagues, I've heard it from people at leading corporations when their university, their corporation, their NGO, whatever it might be, condemns a range of prejudices. They have the whole range there. No anti-Semitism. And why is anti-Semitism missing? Sometimes it's because many people don't recognize it as a prejudice, as I just laid out. They see Jews as resilient. They see Jews as, they're not like the other victims of prejudice. They seem okay. Maybe we're okay because we've faced prejudice so often in our past that it's built into our Jewish communal DNA about recovering. But nonetheless, they fail to understand that we too can be victims of prejudice. That's the innocent explanation. I think there's a less innocent explanation, a less innocuous explanation. Some of those who fight the fight against other prejudices have determined that Jews are incapable of being victims. They see Jews as white. They see Jews as wealthy. They see Jews as powerful. Ipso facto, someone who is white, wealthy, powerful is incapable of being a victim of prejudice. It just doesn't work. And they see themselves as committed to the fight against prejudice, so they are, I call it the Miss Piggy syndrome. What? Me? Being prejudiced? How could that be? So if the Jew is incapable of being a victim, and I'm incapable of being a perpetrator, when Jews come and complain about being subjected to anti-Semitism, they must be making it up, or they must be doing it to hide their own wrongs, or to cover up for Israel. So I want people to try. One of the things I've been doing and talking about, not just in this country, but all over the world, is help people understand what this is. But I think there's another objective that I have, and that is for people to understand the interconnectedness of anti-Semitism. It can't be fought in a silo. I work closely at the State Department with colleagues who are committed to or tasked with the job of fighting for religious freedom, fighting against racial prejudice. We work together in a coalition as often as we can because we recognize that one hate connects to the other hate. Think back, we just heard a very moving talk by the mayor of Highland Park. Think back to another shooting that preceded that one, the Buffalo shooting, the Tip Top supermarket shooting. This young man drove, 150, 200 miles to find a zip code with the most black people in it that he thought most densely black population, and so he could kill as many black people as possible. But if you read his so-called manifesto, I don't suggest you did it. I did it for you. I fulfilled your obligation. It's horrible. It's horrific. Why should he get more hits on it? But if you read his manifesto, it's infused with anti-Semitism. The Jews are our greatest enemy. I'm not saying that, he was really against Jews. He just wanted to kill blacks. What I'm saying is that the two are interconnected. It's part, of course, the great replacement theory that, the Jew is the puppeteer and the black person, who, of course, couldn't be successful on his own or her own, is the puppet. One of the reasons I stress the interconnectedness is because many people believe there's only a limited bandwidth of sympathy. So if I'm talking about racism, I'm not talking about anti-Semitism, or vice versa. If I'm talking about anti-Semitism, I'm not talking about racism. And together with my colleagues, we argue, no, if you're going to fight one, you got to recognize that you're fighting the other. Third objective I think it's third, I lost track. Get people to understand that anti-Semitism is not a niche issue. Jews are, as we often say, the canary in the coal mine. Anti-Semitism has rightly been called the oldest or the longest hatred. Something may begin with the Jews, but it never ends with them. Now, let me add a cautionary note here. We have to know when to call out anti-Semitism, but we also have to recognize when it may be some policy or some action with which we disagree, which we think is stupid, which we think is wrong, but is not necessarily anti-Semitic. There's a lot of talk here, and I'm part of it, about anti-Semitism. We have to paraphrase the book of Ecclesiastes and Bob Dylan, we have to know that there's a time to speak and a time to be silent, a time to call something out and to say, I hate that comment, but it's not anti-Semitic. Because if we call everything anti-Semitism, when it really is, nobody pays attention. Oh, you call everything anti-Semitism. But there's yet another part of my job, and we heard it referenced in the previous panel, so I'll just mention it briefly, and that is something positive, and of course is the Abraham Accords. And I'm not talking about the Abraham Accords necessarily in the relationship with Israel. That's not really part of my portfolio. Those are people in the Near East desk, Israel desk, etc. But one of the reasons why I made my first trip to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where I was received as a government official, and people said to me, will they discuss anti-Semitism with you? I said, my title is Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. They know I'm not coming to talk about climate change, however important and significant that might be. And in fact, they did discuss it with me. I met with the Minister for Islamic Affairs. I went straight from there to Israel. I didn't go straight. I went through the UAE, which is like going from Washington to Philadelphia via New York. But when I arrived in Israel, someone asked me, what is the Minister of Islamic Affairs? I said, it's the equivalent in Israel, would be the equivalent of Rav Rashi Ashkenazim, the chief rabbi for Ashkenazim, Rav Rashi Sfaradim, the chief rabbi for Sfaradim, Rav Rashi Mizrahim, for Middle Eastern Jews, if there was such a thing, the head of the Office of Religious Affairs, the Minister of Religious Affairs, all rolled into one in a country where they respect him and like him. We sat for 90 minutes talking about anti-Semitism and the degree to which it's got to be addressed. I met with young people, journalists and others, who are terribly concerned about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but who separate that from anti-Semitism, who recognize the two are not one and the same. And now, I've been to the UAE. I'm going to be going to Bahrain. My deputy has been to the UAE twice. We go not because these countries are perfect, and not because we totally admire with their human rights records, etc. But my office and my team is committed, and with the strong support of the secretary and the strong support of the president and the vice president, to go and talk to anyone who is serious about thinking about anti-Semitism. We do so, A, because it will reduce Jew hatred, B, because it may well, and I said this in an interview in the New Yorker just recently, there may be the effect of trickle-down human rights. If they stop othering Jews, then they might stop othering other people. One hopes. When I was before you may have heard I had a long confirmation process. Never tweet in the middle of the night, especially if it's about a senator, even if you're right. I stressed for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that I would be an equal opportunity critic of anti-Semitism, irrespective of where it came from, and that's true. What I didn't expect is that I would have the privilege of being an equal opportunity of defender of Jews who have been attacked as Jews. Within a few days in office, I confronted the Lufthansa issue. Some of you may know a group of 130 American citizens were prevented from flying on a Lufthansa flight because some amongst them refused to wear their masks. They were not a group of Haredi Jews. They were a group. They weren't a group. The only thing that bound them was their dress and their personal beliefs. And we worked with Lufthansa on this. We discussed it with them. The CEO flew to Washington to meet with me. And recently, just about a month ago, the Lufthansa accepted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and has appointed a high-ranking official to train their employees, their 105,000 employees, on this issue so it won't happen again. That was one defense. I was in Israel, and I learned that a group of non-traditional, non-Orthodox Jews, progressive Jews, who had been celebrating B'nai Mitzvah at the southern end of the Kotel, had been harassed by, I don't know, call them thugs is to be kind, a group of young Haredi hooligans, who came and just upset and tried to stop these B'nai Mitzvahs from going on. The police were nowhere to be found, and I said and tweeted out that had this happened in any other country, we would have no trouble identifying it as anti-Semitism. I didn't call it anti-Semitism, but I made it a little more vague than that. And just last week, less than a week ago, 4 days ago, I was in Brussels at a conference sponsored by the EU with the strong support of the American government on a religious slaughter, both which affects both Muslim and Jewish communities, halal and shechita, and the attempt to ban it. And why this, while it's really an issue of religious freedom, my argument was that anything that might prevent Jews from living and building full and secure lives in Europe, especially with Europe's history, edges on anti-Semitism. And the EU is taking this very, very seriously. So I've had that privilege to do that as well. Let me turn to the final objective that I see for my office, and that I didn't really imagine that would be the case, but I'm thrilled and delighted and honored that it is. And that is to ensure that the condemnation of anti-Semitism in all its forms is incorporated into the broader configuration of American foreign policy. That has been made possible in great measure by the support I've received from colleagues throughout the State Department, and certainly by the top leadership of the department and the President and Vice President. We have responded with speed to a number of situations, whether it's Chairman Abbas talking about 50 Holocausts in the Berlin Reichstag, whether it's Iran's President Raisi suggesting more research has to be done on the Holocaust, and a whole variety of other things. But it's not just my office that speaks out. We work collaboratively with other offices. We work collaboratively, certainly with the top leadership of the State Department, that it shouldn't just be, the Office on Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism is speaking out, but that the department sees this as deleterious, something deleterious certainly for American foreign policy, American values. And we have seen that repeatedly. And that is really important, that this isn't just an office about treatment of Jews, but office that, again, goes back to that idea, if there is anti-Semitism, democracy is not safe. And I have been thrilled by the success and the support I have received in that regard. Let me close on a personal note, a double personal note. A few weeks ago, I guess it was Erev Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, President Biden, it has been his practice, it was his practice when he was vice president, to speak to a wide range of rabbis, American rabbis, around the time, either Erev Rosh Hashanah or Erev Yom Kippur. And there were 1,300 rabbis on the call. He spoke to them, one of them blessed him. It was a very moving exchange. And then I followed up. It was not a bad, co-starring role, I have to say. When Shelley's office, Shelley is here, Shelley Greenspan's office called me, asked me if I would be willing to. I said, let me think about it, And then I took questions from the rabbis, and one of the final questions came from Rabbi Mark Dratch. Some of you know him from New York, from the OU, and he said to me, tell us how you're able to do your job. What gives you joy? And I said to him, I'm able to do my job because I know what I stand for as a Jew, not just what I stand against. I fight anti-Semitism because I know what I'm fighting for, because I revel in who I am as a Jew. I'm a Jew, an identifying Jew, long before I was a fighter against anti-Semitism. And I told him, and I said the rabbis were free to use this in sermons, so if you heard it in sermons, this is where it came from. I said, I'm glad to have this stolen, that we should never let ourselves become, as we say in Hebrew, biglal, because of anti-Semitism Jews. I had students once come into my office. He'd been my student for 4 years. He was graduating, came in to discuss his graduation plans. Suddenly he's wearing a kippah. And there was part of me that wanted to say, what's with the headgear? But I didn't know if legally I was allowed to do that, so I just ignored it. And as he was getting ready to leave his office, my office, he said, look, and I said, oh yeah, what's that about? How come you didn't wear that before, did you? He said, no. I'm so troubled by the rise of anti-Semitism that I wanted to show the anti-Semites who I was. And on one hand, I loved his chutzpah, his moxie. On the other hand, my heart was breaking, because his identification was not coming from the pull of Judaism, but the push of anti-Semitism. Now, I'm happy to report that that push of anti-Semitism has led him to learn more and to be pulled to our tradition by all it has to offer. But I fear that with all our fears, legitimate concerns, that we're going to see us totally on the defensive as opposed to being aware of the treasure that we have. So that we should never become biglal because of anti-Semitism, Jews, but we should become af al pi, nonetheless. Some of us last night at Havdalah sang Eliyahu Hanavi, and we say the af al pi sheyit mamea, even though Elijah may tarry, nonetheless, I believe. And af al pi, in fact, at the time when there was a ship like the Exodus, one of the ships was called the af al pi chen, the nonetheless. We should be nonetheless. Despite the efforts of the world, so much of the efforts, so much of their strength, so much of their creative energies to harm us and to destroy us, we remain as Jews and we revel in Jews. And finally, I think it was Rabbi Soloveitchik who mentioned the notion of hakarat hatov, being thankful, being grateful. I have had a long and storied career. Many of you I've been privileged to have you as students. And I was satisfied with everything I had done, written many books, et cetera, and then came the call from the White House saying that President Biden was nominating me for this position. I hesitated before saying yes. I had a cushy job. I thought teaching 3 seminars a year was a full-time job. And I could write what I want and say what I want, you know. But a friend, and I was about to say no, and a friend said to me, no, you can make a difference. And suddenly I stopped, because I think there's nothing more than we would want than to make a difference. So I put my name forward, and as I alluded to earlier, it was a long and difficult process. But many people, including many people in this room, had my back. And not only had my back personally, because they were my friends, but they felt I was right for the job. And I am very grateful. One of the cornerstones of Jewish tradition, as I say, is hakarat hatov. One of the first words out of a Jew's mouth in the morning should be modeh ani. Modeh from the word todah, from thank you, thanking God for granting us life and the privilege of having another day. And so I close with these words, modeh ani. I am so very grateful to have this opportunity to make the world safer, not just for Jews, but for democracy and democratic values. I am humbled to do this in the name of our president and the United States government. And I am even more grateful to have so many of you by my side in this important fight. Modeh ani. Thank you.
Deep breath. We might throw around the term loosely in terms of talking about heroes and heroic acts, and I think in your presence, I think we all have one of the heroes of the Jewish people, and on behalf of all of us, thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you. So it's great to see everybody here. It's great to see people staying around after the ambassador has spoken as well. I promise you the panel is going to be insightful in very important and distinct and different ways as well. When I was first asked to be involved with this panel, they said, David Breitman, CEO of the Jewish Education Project, I want you to do a panel on the impact of anti-Semitism on young people today. And I said, it's going to be a pretty short panel. It was a glib response. Now then came Kanye and a whole lot of other stuff, and now the expanse of the conversation. And why do I say that? Is because the topic of anti-Semitism is not here for debate today. Is it rising? Of course, we all know the data. We all know the impact. The topic of the conversation today is how is it being heard? And how are we as a community presenting it, especially to a younger generation, which by virtue of the fact they haven't had the same experiences as we have, are hearing all of this in a very different way than we might be intending it. Now, on one hand, I couldn't think of a worse topic for me to be presenting today. Like, I wish I was talking about something more optimistic and positive about Jewish education and the impact on the Jewish people today. My grandmother, a Holocaust survivor, would be both. I mean, she passed away. This is the yahrzeit coming up to her 1-year anniversary of her death. She'd be, on one hand, thrilled that here I am presenting on this. On the other hand, she'd be like, really? We're still talking about this? It's still happening, and it's still an issue? So originally the topic presented was, what's the impact of anti-Semitism on young people today? And then as you might have seen, we managed to sort of flip the title. And the title now reads, how do we combat anti-Semitism while building flourishing Jewish communities? And the phrase which the ambassador didn't mention, but I think she did coin in some ways, was we should be talking more about the joys and less about the oys of Jewish life today. Now, it also became really clear to me that I might have my opinions, but none compared to some of these experts on this panel today. And I tried to assemble a panel who would shed light from different angles and perspectives about how the world is experiencing, especially from the eyes of a younger generation, anti-Semitism in the world today. And I also said, I'm not going to hide from the tougher issues. And there are some tough and complicated issues, and this panel will hopefully get into it. We do have a brief amount of time today together. I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves by virtue of their opening remarks. Then I've got some pointed questions. We may or may not get time for questions. I'm thinking probably not, but we'll hang around afterwards for questions afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Gina to kick us off and our discussion today about how we build positive Jewish identity in an era of increased anti-Semitism. Gina, over to you. I think over to wherever you're more comfortable.
I'm going to sit here if that's okay with everybody.
Go for it.
Thank you, David. On a warm November day, just about 5 years ago to the day, I received a text from my son Isaac's best friend, Miriam. The text contained a screenshot of an exchange between them that revealed that he was in a state of deep crisis and imminent danger. In his room, he was, a belt around his throat, enjoying the lack of oxygen, and perhaps ready in that moment to say goodbye. I dropped my phone on the hardwood floor, and I ran through the house, screaming his name, using my hands and my feet to cover more stairs more quickly, my mind and my heart racing, my body holding the fear of a moment that was inconceivable in the moment before. This story ends well, and just to be clear, it is not about anti-Semitism. Isaac is now thriving. He's a math major at his university, Baal Koreh in the Orthodox Minyan, VP of the Jewish Students Association. That moment shaped his future, but did not define it. And how it shaped me contains lessons I believe are applicable to our conversation about the future of our Jewish community. I'm Gina Green. I'm the proud mom of 4 tremendous kids, Black, Jewish, and Southern. I'm a strategist and I'm a dreamer. And after working as Chief Strategy Officer at Bend the Arc Jewish Action from 2018 to 2020, I realized that my highest and best purpose was much like that old BASF ad campaign. We don't make the things you buy, we make the things you buy better. And so now I work with people and institutions doing the work of justice and progress inside the Jewish community and outside of it, and help them do it better. I told that family story because the conversation we are about to have today is not theoretical. It is real, it is urgent, and it is necessary. And it requires courage and vulnerability and a confrontation of our own comfort. I told that family story because it illustrates to me what feels most critical about building a world where all people are safe to not just live, but to thrive, is that achieving it demands that we do so from a place of love and not fear. As I ran up those stairs 2 at a time, I was fearful of what would be beyond my son's bedroom. But as we navigated the journey from the depths of that crisis, it was love for him, his truth, and his potential that guided me. not fear. The lesson of love over fear and also solidarity over division is one that was on display nearly 4 years ago, also to the day, when Ben the Ark's Pittsburgh chapter, in the words of my friend and teacher Duff Kent, stood deeply in their grief and firmly in their purpose, organizing a vigil in Squirrel Hill after 11 Jewish souls were murdered at Tree of Life or Le Simcha building on October 27th. 5,000 Pittsburghers from all walks of life marched with them. Hundreds of thousands of allies signed onto their chapter's letter to then President Trump, who was planning a visit to the city. And hundreds of solidarity vigils were organized from coast to coast. Those Pittsburghers said in their letter, "The Torah teaches that every human being is made b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. This means all of us. And our neighbors, Americans, and people worldwide who have reached out to give our community strength, there we find the image of God. While we cannot speak for all Pittsburghers or even all Jewish Pittsburghers, we know we speak for a diverse and unified group when we say, President Trump, you are not welcome in Pittsburgh until you commit yourself to compassionate, democratic policies that recognize the dignity of all of us." They understood that anti-Semitism doesn't exist in a vacuum. They understood that the same white Christian nationalist ideology and rhetoric that killed their neighbors threatened immigrants and women, Black people and Latinos, trans kids and LGBTQ adults, and that our Jewish community is made up of people who share all of these identities and more. So when we talk about building flourishing Jewish communities, we must remember who we are and that our fate is bound up within the multitudes of ourselves. And of course, Israel is interwoven in this analysis. I suspect growing numbers of American Jews, particularly younger ones, look askance at the Jewish community's willingness to accept the anti-Semitism of white Christian nationalists if it comes with the defense of Israel. Now look, I'm as glad as the next person that Kanye West got his just desserts, but how is it that former President Trump is still out here raising money for a 2024 run for president? When we talk about building a flourishing Jewish community, we cannot ignore that more and more of us are willing or unwilling to accept that Jewish safety in Israel requires the oppression of millions of Palestinians, that cozying up to anti-Semites if they're Zionists makes us any safer in the United States, or that critique of Israel is off the table for Jewish folks around the world. At central issue here is that the machinery of division and fear of which anti-Semitism is a part seeks to divide us from the very communities whose safety is equally threatened by the white Christian nationalism that threatens our lives and our democracy. And let us not ignore that we are having this conversation on the eve of significant elections in both the United States and Israel, where lives and rights are on the ballot. In 2015, a colleague who has studied right-wing movements in the US clued me in on the fact that democracies don't die overnight, they crumble from the inside over time. And the clock has been ticking for quite some time. If we want to be about building flourishing Jewish communities, we must be willing to interrogate the status quo. And I say this as someone who literally just days ago returned from the land. The night of my return, I was in conversation with a dear friend, a fellow Black Jew, about what it's like to hold our identities in this moment in various spaces. Often, when we are in rooms like this, filled with many white-presenting Jews, it is expected, as Black folks, that we will be unilateral and unrelenting critics of Israel, with nothing positive to say about the country that has done and meant and been so much to the Jewish people. And yet in Black spaces, there exists an expectation that we are part of an uncritical chorus of support for everything that the state says or does. Neither are true for either of us. We critique Israel the way we critique the US because we believe in both countries being the very best versions of themselves on both a micro and a macro level. What if we and our Black Jewish families have to peace out on this so-called democracy that we call the US? Where can we go where we can be safe? The only answer to that is a place where the inherent humanity of every single person, Black, Jewish, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli, everywhere, is reflected in word and deed and law and policy. That will be the best version of ourselves. When Ben the Ark and Uprise conducted research 2 years ago on how we talk about anti-Semitism, we asked people to imagine what it would feel like to live in a world where there wasn't any. And it was nearly impossible for people to do. Nothing is needed now more than a willingness to consider that something else, something better is possible, I'm already there. You might be able to detect that. And I don't expect everyone in this room to agree with me or join me just yet. But what I want, what our communities need, is for you, as leaders, to be able to listen to the diverse voices and ideas that exist in our communities. We can't be afraid to challenge the status quo. The Jewish community that we are shaping up to be simply will not permit it. Because when we see others' humanity and they see ours, like those leaders in Pittsburgh, we fight anti-Semitism. When we refuse to be divided from people whose safety and future is bound up with ours, we fight anti-Semitism. And when we realize that those communities are actually part and parcel of our own Jewish community, which is nearly as diverse as America itself, that is when we build a flourishing Jewish community that can hold all of us, no matter where we come from or what we look like. In closing, I'll share my favorite midrash that I've taught literally dozens of times because it perfectly illustrates to me the highest of our best selves and our best nations, and a vision for the future that I know feels impossible to see. God gathered the dust of the first human from the four corners of the world: red, black, white, and green. Red is the blood, black is the innards, and green for the body. Why from the four corners of the earth? So that if one comes from the east to the west and arrives at the end of his life, as he nears departing from this world, it will not be said to him, "This land is not the dust of your body, it's of mine. Go back to where you were created." Rather, every place that a person walks, from there she was created, and from there she will return.
Adam?
My journey in the professional Jewish space began actually when I was first offered an opportunity to work for the Alpha Epsilon Pi fraternity. My job was the director of the international director of Jewish and philanthropic programming, which it was my job to try and help go around the country and turn a Friday night beer pong tournament into a meaningful Shabbat dinner experience and fundraise for some cause. I had moderate success, enough so that it opened an opportunity for me to then go work at AIPAC as the leadership development director, first as the deputy, then the director, where it was my job to work in the AIPAC milieu, engaging high school and college students. I did that for about a decade and then was invited to have this opportunity to join the Jewish Federations of North America as the Associate Vice President for Public Affairs with a portfolio focusing on combating anti-Semitism and Israel delegitimization, and as the Executive Director of the Israel Action Network. What I would say throughout the through line here for me, which I hope we get into really digging into some of the examples of what makes flourishing Jewish communities, has been starting with this theme that is now so apparent in the entire GA, which is the proudness of who we are and cherishing fully who we are as a Jewish people, running towards what Judaism has to offer us. When I was at AEPI, the number of times that I was dealing with a chapter who was thinking, the way to be the coolest chapter on campus is to run away from our Judaism and try and recruit cooler guys than the Jews, were the ones that always failed. It was the chapters who ran towards the Jewish identity and recruited from the people who wanted to be part of something special and uniquely Jewish, who were the ones that then really thrived in all of the other ways, including when I was at AEPI UC San Diego and we won IFC football that year. That was a different part of the Jewish Pride. But then the through line here to the opportunity with Jewish Federations of North America, and I sat down with Eric Fingerhut. I sat down and talked to the plethora of people who I now have the opportunity to call friends and colleagues throughout the JCRC and Federation system and many partners, that flourishing Jewish communities are about being welcoming and educated and safe and secure and nourished in our neshamas. And this, when we do that well, the anti-Semitism, the combating anti-Semitism piece comes along. And so we'll dig into some of those examples in the conversation.
Great, thanks, Adam. over to Samantha, who is the author of a newly released book called #Antisemitism, and I'm sure you'll work out why she's on this panel today.
Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. In addition to being the author of #Antisemitism, I'm a lifelong Jewish educator, a lifelong Jewish learner. I'm a new mom. Several people here have held my baby today. He's upstairs. I am an educator on Jewish teens. I have taught the babies of several people in this room today, and I'm a third-generation Holocaust survivor. In some ways, I was meant to become an expert on anti-Semitism, and in other ways, I was very much not. I grew up with the stories of anti-Semitism from a much earlier age than probably I should have, because I had no sense of the arc of history, and there was a longer than is probably socially acceptable period of time where I thought that my grandmother was a member of the Von Trapp family from The Sound of Music, because they escaped the Nazis and they had a 7-year-old and she was 7 when she escaped the Nazis, and I learned about this so young that it just seemed like it made sense that we were Von Trapps, and a part of me still kind of thinks that's true.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I knew about anti-Semitism, and I rolled my eyes at it. My grandma, when I traveled, was the first one to tell me, put that Jewish star. If I can't get you to take it off, at least put it inside your collar. Don't be too loud. And I, very defiantly, very high school-ly and college-ly, loud and proud, all the time. And then I started working with Jewish teens, with Jewish high school students. And when I started doing my doctoral research, I wanted to talk about flourishing and thriving Jewish communities. I interviewed high school students who had completed congregational B'nai Mitzvah programs, but who had not continued with their formal Jewish engagement. I'm sure we all know them. And I wanted to understand why. What was the value add that they saw Judaism as bringing to their lives? Because they were proud to be Jewish. They loved being Jewish, but they weren't coming to the programs that I was running or my amazing colleagues in the field of Jewish teen engagement. So what was keeping them from being there? And one of the questions that I asked in that context was, what comes to mind when I say Jewish space? What is a Jewish space for you? And I got every answer that I expected: school, synagogue, Israel, camp, grandma's house. And then I asked the follow-up question, do you feel comfortable in whatever space came up for you as a Jewish space? Thinking maybe, is the reason that they're not here something that we did that if we changed, we could get them to come back? And I thought that I would have the types of conversations that my millennial peers and I were having. Was my gender identity affirmed in Jewish spaces, and was keeping me from there? Were my Israel politics welcome? Were my domestic politics part of the mainstream? And instead, the answers that I got were what I've since coined as tragically practical. Well, you know, since the shooting at Tree of Life, the synagogue that my family goes to always has an armed guard in front of it, so I feel comfortable there. Or the day school in my community got funding for bulletproof glass for all the windows, so it sucks that that needed to happen, and I don't know if I feel fully comfortable knowing that that's a reality, but I'm glad that they're there, so I guess I feel comfortable. And I realized that the world that I had grown up in already had this generation gap, because I was able to roll my eyes at my grandma and say that I finally figured out that we are not, in fact, Von Trapps, and anti-Semitism and the Nazis and everything else that I was supposed to be afraid of were a blip of history, and instead I was coming of age within the blip in a moment where we didn't have to be concerned, but the learners that I have the honor and privilege of working with, in fact, do. And they are making choices in the face of rising anti-Semitism. Some of them are Jewish choices that many of us in this room would say are part of what it means to be in a thriving Jewish community. To be defiant, to say, I'm gonna wear my Jewish star loud and proud, that's great. But what do we do when we know that that's because, as Ambassador Lipstadt said, it's a part of defiance, not necessarily a thought about thriving? What do we do when, again, I have definitely run the programs, when we lose teens from B'nai Mitzvah through the moment where their parents freak out about Israel on campus and send them back to come and learn how to stand up for Israel? And I have run that crash course many a time. what do we do when that's what's bringing people? And we know that in some ways it's working. We know that there are choices being made because of anti-Semitism and despite it. And knowing that this is the backdrop against which the next generation is coming of age poses, I think, just new answers that I hope we'll go into to these age-old questions.
Okay, thank you everyone for getting us started. And I'm going to try and I want to try and double down on this notion of the generational change taking place. I'm going to just cite a couple of things which have taken place recently. So one is the notion that I don't think our young people know enough about these anti-Semitic tropes. So for example, a few years ago, you might remember there was a cartoon in the New York Times with a dog being led by a collar, and it had clearly Israel imagery there associated with Bibi and associated with the president. And we ran this by a whole lot of teenagers, and they just couldn't pick it. They couldn't pick the trope, right? They couldn't work out. And again, we had it last week. There were people looking at the Kanye West example, and there were many Jewish teens. They knew it was bad because someone was telling them it was bad. They didn't really understand what was taking place. So these generational things, and that's what I really wanted to get you in on. But then there was one incident which was really, I want to put it out here for this audience. When the Tree of Life massacre took place in Pittsburgh, we interviewed a group of teenagers and we asked them what their reactions were. And we had one group of teenagers telling us quite categorically that this was an evidence of an example of anti-Semitism. Yeah, there's a shooting in a synagogue on Shabbat. And then we had another group of teenagers who came out and forthrightly told us this may or may not have been anti-Semitism, but what this really was a manifestation of racism, xenophobia, and the lack of gun control in American society. And it could have happened to anyone, anywhere else, because they had a list of shootings in high schools and in other places, which they just saw the Pittsburgh shooting as just another example, and they didn't see it as an example of anti-Semitism. So I want to use that as a foundation to ask you all the questions like, what do you see as the generational changes taking place, and how do you respond from your vantage point? Let's start with Samantha and your piece there. I think, yeah.
I didn't know who you were looking at.
Sorry.
I think the generational challenge is that of universalism and particularism. To be Jewish is to be part of a particularistic community, a broad one to say the least, and by no means a monolith, but to be part of something different. And for Gen Zers, they are by nature universalists. They are citizens of the world. They are very comfortable in a global context, and it's really awkward to then be part of something exclusive, to say that this is something just ours, it's different. And particularism is really a challenge when they are very comfortable universalizing things that many in previous generations were not. Tree of Life is an example. Another one that I definitely have heard a lot of is, for many, I assume I can speak for many in this room, to see the Holocaust and Holocaust imagery applied to contemporary issues external to the Jewish community hits us somewhere. It's awkward. That's something that we don't want to have taken and given universalist meaning necessarily. But Gen Zers are really comfortable with that. I had one young woman who is a student at SUNY Binghamton who I interviewed for my book, who, when speaking about what it means to be part of the final generation that's going to meet and have meaningful relationships with Holocaust survivors, was speaking about the detention camps on the southern border. This was several years ago. And she said, why wouldn't we want to compare those to the Holocaust and to concentration camps if that's what's going to get people aware of it? If that's going to trigger people, that was a good thing. And I know that, again, there are people in this room who I'm sure fell on every end of the spectrum of that debate. So I think the universalism is the generational change, and figuring out how to allow for these pockets of particularism in a way that's deeply countercultural is our challenge.
Gina.
I think what's also related to that is that when we think about the particular shooting in Pittsburgh, and Ambassador Lipstadt talked about the Great Replacement theory, that white people are being replaced by people of color in this country, and there's a white genocide happening. The manifesto of the shooter, like, anti-Semitism is what all of that rests on, right? And so it is really important for, I think, folks to, and I think people understand, and children, youth, young people understand and get that in exactly the way Samantha was just laying out, that anti-Semitism is related to all of these oppressions, and they actually can't be separated out. So for folks who are growing up in an era of mass shootings, from Pittsburgh to Buffalo to, you name it, across the country, people who are gay, people who are Latino, immigrants being attacked for being who they are. It is exactly the interwovenness the ambassador was speaking about, and it's impossible to separate them out for people. And we shouldn't expect this generation to do that either.
So I'm always wary about how much to push the question. Why do you think so many young Jews in America were able and willing to stand up for the Black Lives Matter movement, but so few of them are willing to stand up for anti-Semitism and be proudly up against anti-Semitism in public spaces?
I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I would love to see some more anecdote or some data that can prove that more Jewish kids were standing up for Black Lives Matter than for combating and fighting anti-Semitism. I don't know that that's necessarily the case.
Samantha, you saw some of that in your work, yeah?
It's really exciting and empowering to be the helper. It's really awkward to be the one who asks for help. I think to identify as a victim, to say that my community is the victim of anti-Semitism, as opposed to we are here to be allies, we are here to be proactive members of a progressive community that we so believe in, it's really hard. It's hard, as you were saying, to figure out what counts as anti-Semitism. I'm seeing Clevelanders in this room. The first case of COVID-19 in the state of Ohio was the person who I shared an office with in Cleveland, who got it at APAC Policy Conference. We were on a bus together with 50 high school seniors from different schools around Cleveland who we had brought to policy conference, who came home, and we were the first people to be quarantined. It was great. We're all on the WhatsApp group, like what are you binge watching at that point? That was before anyone else was at home. And I heard, all the people are calling COVID the Jew flu. Isn't that funny? Like, it rhymes, it has Jew, it's flu, this is great, it's about us. Has anyone here ever heard about the last time Jews were accused of bringing a plague to a community and Jewish associations with pestilence and disease? They had no idea. And this is not a knock by any means on the education that they've received, but to say, if I don't even realize something counted as anti-Semitism, how am I standing up towards it? And the final part that I will say is Gen Zers today are coming of age in a moment where there is an uptick in anti-Semitism. It is coming from the left, it's coming from the right, it's coming in their phones. They're also very aware theirs may not be the biggest problems. This was coming up, George Floyd and the protests that happened were coming up at the exact same moment. To say, someone hurt my feelings, we should all talk about that, when also these problems in our country are so deep and hit them so deeply, made it really hard to then say, let's talk about me right now, when they were so entrenched in that world of allyship.
If I could add a vignette of experience, especially dealing with, like, on a college campus, for example, students who, the conversations and the discourse around the societal challenges, especially systemic challenges that many of these students are trying to address right now, an environment where, on a campus, where discussion about representation, about access to education, about opportunities, where on the buildings are Jewish names. Mm-hmm. The presidents of a university or trustees are Jewish. To try and have that conversation, I think that there's also an aspect here of young people grappling with, as Samantha, you're saying, building on this point of understanding and recognizing where their identity and where their struggle fits relative to what their peers are experiencing as well.
So Adam, I'm going to get you to pick up here on that part, especially about college campus, where some of the discourse is and again, I'm trying to use words cautiously. Our job as a community is to prepare our youth to be the foot soldiers of Israel and the Jewish people when they get to college campus, so they can fight anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism wherever and whenever they are going to experience it. So I've done a lot there. But particularly I want to focus on this generational change, which could get us into some murky territory. We heard a bit of it at the plenary, it wasn't quite as explicit. But this conflation with anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, and anti-Semitism is really prominent in the minds of young people today, who I believe are pushing back against some of the generational norms which tend to conflate those three terms, and they're trying to pass it in ways which are actually more complicated than many of us and the institutions we represent are prepared to do, or at least prepared to do so in public. So Adam, you've got a lot of experience with the Israel engagement space, especially on college campus. I'd love you to offer some words on that one.
I think that to start with, I mean, just to really level set, and I've been experiencing this myself as a student as well as my career now focusing on college campuses, that to try and say that there are those who are using Israel as a very thinly veiled replacement for the term Jew or for Jewish identity is not paying attention. I mean, there is absolutely a concerted effort to use Zionism, to use the state of Israel, as the ambassador who in her latest book on anti-Semitism, the idea that anti-Semitism is the projection of the greatest ills of society onto the Jewish people. And in a time where the colonialism, at a time when xenophobia, at a time when the idea of some of these like particularist ideas are at the forefront of discussion, Israel is being projected as the worst offender of all of these. That right after the end of the Second World War, where it was a war to end all wars, the UN, which agrees upon this notion that never again will there be war to determine borders, but that the UN and negotiations, that they're then using those very foundations and frameworks to delegitimize Israel. And uniquely Israel is a huge problem. That said, there's also, I think, a piece of this generational wrestling which you, in your framing of the question, makes me think about as if an analogy I might think about preparing high school students to go to college is like if your family is about to go on vacation to Martha's Vineyard for the very first time. And to prepare for what the family vacation at Martha's Vineyard might be like, let's watch a movie, Jaws. This is what our family vacation is going to look like. If you're saying that you will, or like in another cultural reference point, Mean Girls, where the gym teacher says, "Do not have sex because you will get pregnant and you will die," it repels, I think, people from this notion of finding something to fight towards and run towards. But I've also experienced that there are many people who they want or they crave this notion of give me the tools, give me the information, give me the resources to be able to go and push back against these efforts because they are real efforts. We're seeing in the BDS campaign right now, there's a lot of discussion with a local-based company, Morningstar, where there's a question about whether or not their sustainable and socially responsible investing practices are bleeding into BDS. And to a certain extent, to make a very long story short, at a certain point, there was a moment where there were people who on the Morningstar side saying, well, we just believe that by being associated with Israel, we're going to acknowledge that this could be something that is a human rights violation. And we're trying to say that coming with that bias approach is problematic. And to a certain extent, being able to, the conversation came to a point of, well, let's just agree to disagree on that foundational question. And so how do we prepare or give a generation the history, the tools, the framework, the confidence to be able to go into a room where somebody is approaching a conversation from such a remarkably flawed foundational point on the conversation of Israel, not recognizing the way in which their own framework of the conversation, where they may think it's about human rights because they've been indoctrinated in a way of looking at this conversation as solely human rights, is actually deeply problematic and anti-Semitic. And so a Jewish person or a pro-Israel person, but in particular the Jewish people who are trying to say, I am a proud Jew, and I'm trying to be on a college campus where I'm just trying to get a degree, I'm trying to go get a job, I'm trying to meet friends, I'm trying to be in this world, and somebody is saying that a deeply integral part of my identity, because the first 18 years of my life, I was proud about the connection to Israel, and I visited for my bar mitzvah, and they planted a tree for me, and I have family there, and Israel is the embodiment of Jewish self-determination, and this huge part of my identity suddenly is somehow, by virtue of just being a part of it, I am a baby killer, I am a colonizer. Oh, but no, that's not, I'm not anti-Semitic, that's just my political opinion about Zionism. And I think that that's a real struggle for young people today.
But Adam, the indoctrination can go both ways. I mean, one of the things, I co-host a Mental Brief podcast from the Forward, and one of the questions that we tackled this past year was from parents who said, our kids are in college, they're in high school, they're going off and they're learning from others, they're uncovering more information than they got in day school, than they got in camp, than they got in synagogue. They're being confronted with information that they never knew, and they're saying, how could you lie to me? How could you not tell me the full truth of what happens in the land, whose lives are safe, whose lives matter? And so I think it's really important because kids, young people today are not able, I shouldn't say they're not able, but they're able to see that everything isn't always perfect. And just as the United States hasn't gotten it right, I told my husband this past weekend, I was like, there's an American experiment and there's an Israeli experiment. And in both places, we have so much more to do and learn and be. And can we? And I think kids today are seeing that maybe we didn't always give the entire story, the full story. And I think it's incumbent upon us, if we want to build these flourishing Jewish communities, we can't leave that population of people behind who are asking us to interrogate the status quo and think about the messages that we've sort of hewn ourselves to for decades.
So when I agreed to be part of this panel, there were 3 issues and plus one that I said, if we're going to hit anti-Semitism and talk about young people today, we couldn't do it properly without talking about generational change. We couldn't talk about it properly without dealing with issues of race, and we couldn't deal with it properly without dealing about issues related to Israel. So we've checked all 3. And then there was the plus one. And the plus one was, now this is going to be really complicated to try and frame, and I'll try and offend as few people as possible. The manipulation of anti-Semitism to better the Jewish people, by the Jewish people. In terms of, young people are very attuned to when people are utilizing anti-Semitism in order to fundraise, in order to promote a specific experience that they think is good for you, to encourage young people to go to Israel. And there's almost in their eyes, I think, and again, Gina could ask me the question, where's the data? And that's a fair question. And almost in their eyes, some Jewish communal organizations of a certain stature or certain age representing the community are sort of smiling in the same way that that woman approached Natan Sharansky said, anti-Semitism is actually good for Jewish community continuity, etc., which actually turns young people away. And I'm wondering if anyone has anything to offer on how you might see young people actually rebelling against the very instruments that many of us in this room are often utilizing to actually better our causes as well. Apologies for anyone. Samantha, you want to try it?
Sure. I think that's real. I mean, I think that young people are really savvy and they absolutely know when something is trying to be sold to them, or when there's, again, the frisson of excitement of Kanye, this is going to be really good for our PR for a few days. They know and they get it. I think what we need to be doing is figuring out the authenticity. How is it, David, you and I work at the Jewish Education Project. They need to be spending more time in Jewish spaces when it comes especially to Israel, to say that and this is not me, I had a very specific Israel experience, but to say that there are many young people who learn about Israel on a 3rd grade religious school curriculum, and then the next time it comes up is when, again, we're trying to give them a crash course on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism before going to college campus, then absolutely they are right if they say the community is doing fear-mongering and using this as a way to get us back in the door. So what can we be doing to scaffold? What can we be doing to actually walk the talk of when we say meeting them where they are and then pushing them? And to figure out what are the spaces that are ripe with, and there are so many of them, with opportunity to connect with these young people, not just in moments of crisis, or not just when we see an opportunity to move them towards their next step, but to be with them along the way as they go between those steps.
So let's use this, and I'll give you all now. You've got the Jewish communal infrastructure is in front of you. This is the leadership. One message to send off from the panel to the Jewish Federations of North America, the GA. Samantha, I'll get you to
Still me?
continue on the flow, because I think Jewish education will come up as part of it. But let's.
Jewish education is good. That's it. Jewish education is good. We should do more of it. No? Okay. I think that, the message that I would really come away with is our young people are everything that we give them credit for and more. They are not the leaders of tomorrow. They are leaders today and right now. And how are we getting them into this room, into the spaces where any of us are spending time, when we're talking about Israel, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, when we're talking about these flourishing and thriving communities, not that just that we're striving to build, that for many of us in the pockets that we spend our time in, thankfully exist in some ways. We're not here to necessarily pass those on, but we need to bring them around the table right now, and we are missing something when they're not in those spaces.
Thank you. Gina?
I'll just say that I think that part of building flourishing Jewish communities, like I said in my remarks, is that we actually have to recognize sort of who we are, know who we are, and really make and shape the world where all of these communities and all of these identities can thrive. I think in the United States, that means fighting for a democracy that a lot of young people haven't seen themselves in ever. And so what does it mean for us to invest in them, invest in their leadership, invest in their engagement, both in Jewish community and outside of it? How do we give them the tools to reach across difference and build that community? Because we as Jews are not safe when anybody else is unsafe. And so to the extent that these relationships can be fostered across community, across difference, I think we're all the better for it.
Great, thank you. Adam?
I would say that the Jewish Federations, in all of its iterations, historically, has always existed to address the needs and the interests of the Jewish community by harnessing the power of the collective. And my one-sentence answer to your previous question, though, is that there is an anxiety, there is a fear, there is also a moment here with the community where they are looking to answers of how to grapple with and understand this moment of a rise in anti-Semitism. So I appreciate and understand part of the framing of the question, and also offer that there is a need and there is an interest from the community for that type of work from Federation. And the Federations have been working, on the one hand, towards the physical security piece of communities, especially in recent years, which we heard about through Live Secure and other important initiatives that we've been working on. But to these points about what really makes the Jewish community the safest, this idea of sharing power, this idea of being able, as the Jewish community, to bring what we have learned, where we've succeeded, what we understand in terms of the importance of community relations, being able to be in a community, really a part of a community, immersing ourselves. The work that the JCRCs do every single day, and what federations need to be doing more of, these are the superpowers of what our collective opportunity and potential is in this moment and in fighting back. And it's a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to be a part of this family with the federations in this moment in history.
So I guess that's really the summary of this panel and this presentation today. It's not in any way to minimize the real threat of anti-Semitism in the world today, both in a physical sense and in a verbal sense. We didn't even talk explicitly about social media as well, but the impact that's having on our young people, it was sort of referenced throughout. And then to acknowledge that when we talk to our people about this, that there are different audiences and different generations that might hear certain things in different ways. I use this quite a lot, but it might be different in terms of saying that people don't get involved very often for the first time in Israel engagement because of the fight about Israel. They get involved because of their first engagement experience. Now, sometimes anti-Semitism works in a different way, but like we were talking before, when a 10th grade student is sitting in their social studies class and for the last 10 years has been trying to hide their Jewish identity, and then they read Elie Wiesel or they read Anne Frank for the first time and they become the Jew in the class, then they know it's getting real for them as well. And I think one of the points that was made before, like, it's incumbent upon us to ensure that our young people today especially understand their Jewish heritage, be proud of being Jewish, first and foremost in the Jewish environment that we create for them, in all of the experiences that we create for them, rather than have it thrust upon them from a negative impact for the first time when they may experience it in a more hostile environment. I'm really grateful for today's panel for shedding more nuance and complexity to today's issue. We'll be around afterwards, but as I said, hopefully the next GA we won't be talking about anti-Semitism as much, we'll be talking about even more positive things. But thank you very much to everybody here.